Okay, right, good evening all. Welcome to this week's lecture in GV311, which is about accountability to Parliament. We heard last week from Professor George Jones with his take on the select committee system. Well, those of you who were here last week will have heard that. But what we have this week is a speaker who is actually at the heart of that system. He is Richard Bacon MP, who is the Member of Parliament for Norfolk South. But beyond that is the, I'm not sure if there is such a concept, but I will call the Senior Conservative Member on the Public Accounts Committee. So when you see the Public Accounts Committee, Mrs Hodge, all of that, Richard Bacon will be sitting immediately to her right.
Yes.
Right, in a sense, or left, depending on where you're looking from. And the other thing I think it's important to note is that Richard was a student at the LSE some years ago, so brings a sort of a view from Parliament, but with an understanding of the school. Richard.
Great. Well, Tony, thank you very much indeed. I have one control mechanism to help me with this, and that's my stopwatch. So I'm going to turn it on now before I forget. I beg your pardon. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm going to talk about a number of kinds of accountability. And in particular, you won't be surprised to hear me say financial accountability, because the Public Accounts Committee, as the name suggests, has quite a lot to do with money. But I'm not only going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about, because the Public Accounts Committee is one of the select committees, the way in which select committees have grown and changed. I'm going to talk about the view of committees, as it were, versus the Chamber of the House of Commons and traditional views of the Chamber, and the way in which the Chamber has changed and in the way in which committees have changed. I'm going to talk about the way the committee I'm on, the Public Accounts Committee, works in cooperation with this country's supreme audit institution, the National Audit Office. I'm going to talk about the kind of accountability which you would normally be accustomed to seeing on television through a minister standing at the dispatch box and accounting for the actions of the government, and also legal and financial accountability, which in some senses is quite different. I'm going to talk about the role of the accounting officer, which will be familiar to anyone who remembers the Yes Minister series. Sir Humphrey Appleby, who was the permanent secretary, or the permanent Under-Secretary of State for Administrative Affairs, with his minister famously Jim Hacker, is also known, the permanent secretary is also known as the accounting officer, and has very specific responsibilities laid down very precisely. And I shall talk a little bit about some of the other themes that have emerged over the years that I've experienced and seen during my time on the committee, and some possible thoughts for how things might change. But I was going to start with something slightly different. Has everyone got one of those, the reading list that I just handed out? You've all got one, have you? Great, terrific. I thought it would be worthwhile to spend 5 minutes going through this to sort of survey the landscape, as it were, because there's an awful lot out there, even within one small domain, such as the one which I've worked in ever since I was elected to Parliament in 2001. There's an awful lot. And I thought it would be helpful to just very briefly run through this and point up some things which I think you may find of interest, depending on which particular things you wish to pursue. The first thing, I mentioned the National Audit Office earlier. That is the supreme audit institution for the UK, and they audit all government bodies. So they have about 560 or so different audits, financial audits that they do. They prepare the report and accounts. Actually, the internal audit for that department, whichever one it is, prepares the financial accounts, but then the auditor, like the same relationship would apply in a private sector institution, the auditor would come in and check them over, and when they're published by the National Audit Office, and they're signed off. It's not quite true and fair view in the way one is familiar with from private sector companies, but there is a similar jargon around propriety and proper use of public funds. And the Controller and Auditor General, who's the senior officer of the National Audit Office and who's responsible for, he's got legal responsibilities that are defined quite carefully, including his independence, all stemming from the National Audit Act 1983. And he's also, crucially, an officer of the House of Commons. So the National Audit Office is not a government department. It used to be called the Exchequer and Audit Department within the Treasury, but it was reformed in 1983, it hived off into a completely separate body and has become much more influential, and frankly its quality has grown enormously over the last 30 years, so that it is now one of the world's leading supreme audit institutions. They, with one or two other SAIs, do the audit for the United Nations, for example, on a rotation. And they have an extraordinary website with everything they've ever published. So it's really worth taking a look, and that's there right at the top. The reason I mentioned the PAC right high up in this context as well, and I will come back to it later, but just so it's clear, the work of the PAC is predominantly taking evidence on National Audit Office reports. Now, as it happens, we very rarely take evidence on those financial audits that I was talking about, the 560 or so audit reports. That takes probably 3/4 of the staff of the NAO. They have about 800 staff. 600 of these people are auditors beavering away producing financial accounts for everything from the Ministry of Defence to the NHS Litigation Authority to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and many, many smaller public bodies of various kinds. And the work of the PAC does not, by and large, involve looking at that. We kind of take it on trust, mostly, unless there's a problem, and if there is, they'll draw it to our attention and recommend that we perhaps should hold a hearing on it. But generally speaking, we take it on trust that the auditors can count and that the numbers add up, and that bit does not comprise the bulk of our work. 40 years ago, actually, it did. In the 1970s, and prior to that, the Public Accounts Committee, which, by the way, met in secret in those days, as recently as the 1970s, spent most of its time looking at financial audit. We now spend most of our time looking at the other the output of the other quarter of the staff. In other words, the 200 people who are doing something else. What those other 200 people out of the 800 in the NAO are doing is producing value for money studies. They are taking a particular area of public expenditure and prodding it and poking it and seeing whether it is effective and efficient and economic. The National Audit Office is statutorily prohibited from looking at the merits, from questioning the merits of government policy. So to put it in simple terms, they would never say the government should be spending more money on roads and less money on rail, or vice versa. They'd never say that, because that is a political judgment, it's a political choice, it's a policy choice, in effect. What they'd say is, given that you've made a decision to spend money on roads, did you spend that money effectively and efficiently and economically? In other words, did you achieve as much bang for your buck as you could? In other words, was it value for money? And the reports that the NAO produces cover pretty much everything with a pound sign on them. So as a consequence of that, our committee, which spends 95% of its time taking evidence on these reports, looks at everything with a pound sign on it. So one moment we could be looking at the F-45 destroyer, and the next minute we could be looking, we do 2 hearings a week. The NAO produces 50 or so, 50 to 60 of these value for money studies per year. Some of them are technical and really the audience is government departments themselves, but most of them are for the public as a whole, and you will often hear about them on the radio in the morning. Sometimes, depending on how controversial it is, it'll be the top item on the news. But you won't tend to, you'll filter out the words National Audit Office because the focus will be on, when you're listening to it, because the focus will be on what the story is about. So, for example, I remember in December 2001, you'll remember we had a party leader, Ian Duncan Smith, who is now the Work and Pension Secretary, who, by common consent, didn't outperform as party leader. He did it for 2 years, did his very best, but he was up against Tony Blair, and it wasn't going so well. There was one occasion when he absolutely bested him at Prime Minister's Question Time, and it was on the 19th of December 2001. I remember it very well, because it was the day that the NAO report was published, entitled Inappropriate Adjustments to NHS Waiting Lists, which sounds pretty dry, but in fact it was, as you can surmise, about the fiddling of waiting lists. So people, for example, in hospital corridors were having a curtain pulled around them so that they met the 4-hour waiting time for being treated, and so on and so forth. There were any number of ways to game the system in that particular respect, as indeed is true of virtually every other domain, including health and education and policing and so on. The content of the NAA reports is part of the warp and weft of weekly and monthly discourse in Whitehall and Westminster, because they are very, very carefully thought through reports, and they're not done. Essentially, they have the statutory right to go in and look at everything. They're not a mirror to the Public Accounts Committee. They won't show us everything, but they do have the right to look at everything. They have the right to look at every email, every invoice. They audit the Secret Intelligence Services and the Security Service. So that they are a very trusted part of our polity. And then they produce authoritative reports, which are very carefully fact-checked with the department. So they're usually signed off as to fact through what's called a clearance process. And so you can pretty much rely on the content in terms of quality, normally. And it provides a sensible basis for discussion of whether the department is doing as well as it should be with the implementation of what are its policies. So that's the National Audit Office. I'm going back to my reading list now. I would probably say less on the NAA now because I've said more than I intended to just then. But you'll see there the word essential. Now, this was Tony's word, and I didn't knock it out because my book was at the top of the list, so I thought I'd leave it in. But the fact is, much of this is interesting, and there's a huge amount of it. And I would encourage you to dive in. If you go onto my website, which is richardbacon.org.uk, you will find there, in black and white, quite visible on the front page, a little box called Documents for LSE Students. And most of the things on there, certainly the ones in blue, are hot links on my website, so you can just go and look at them. I would particularly recommend, in relation to understanding the whole financial process, the way in which a budget is brought together, the way in which the appropriations process goes through Parliament, and the way in which a budget is constructed, priorities are weighed up, and the way in which then later on the ex post hoc process of scrutiny, which is what we do on our committee, happens. I'd particularly recommend one of the little books at the bottom by Alex Brazier of the Hansard Society, The Fiscal Maze, which was actually the result of a round table which took place here in the school some years ago. That's a very thorough account of the architecture of it, as is also, actually, you'll see higher up, the UK experience aspects of parliamentary scrutiny and the evolving role of the Public Accounts Committee. If you're looking for a fairly straightforward account of the various different aspects of the process, I'd look at those two. The second one, the higher one up, actually was based on a paper I gave to a speech I gave to a conference in Turkey some years ago, and I remember showing it to a chap called the Clerk of Supply. I didn't even know we had a Clerk of Supply, but we do. Fantastic title. Who corrected it for me as to fact. But it's got the thing to remember about this whole architecture and this whole process is there are many things in it. The consolidated fund, the supplementary estimates, the chairman of Ways and Means, which are as fog, not only to most members of the public and many political science students, but to most members of Parliament as well. We all drift along in happy ignorance of these things. But if you want to look, most of us need to look it up if we need to check something. But if you want to look it up, those are two places where you might go and do that. I'll come on quickly now to the parliamentary reports, because, and particularly, not only, because there are a whole load of them there, but particularly the work of the Public Administration Committee, which is a sister committee of the Public Accounts Committee, which has a broader remit to look at the way in which government works and the way in which civil servants and ministers interact. And it's got a fairly loose remit, actually. It can go wherever it decides, really. And in the last Parliament, Bernard Jenkins is now the chair, but in the last Parliament, Dr. Tony Wright was its chairman. I think he did 8 years, actually, who was, by background, a political scientist and academic before he came into Parliament. And he's now at, I think he's at UCL, thank you. I know Margaret said something that she thought was off the record at a seminar he was leading at Birkbeck, and she found it in the newspapers the next day. His work, apart from anything else, it's important to say, the so-called Wright reforms are named after him and included, among other things, the election of Select Committee chairpersons, chairmen, chairwomen, for the first time, so that instead of it happening as it had always done hitherto, which was by a sort of curious process of smoke and mirrors that made the choosing of a pope look fairly straightforward, instead of that you have an election and you have a secret ballot. And that really has been one of the facts that has elevated the select committees and their prominence and their independent authority. And you can think of a number of select committee chairs, like Keith Vaz of the Home Affairs Committee, or John Whittingdale of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee, or indeed, of course, Margaret Hodge of the Public Accounts Committee, all of whose authority has, to some extent, been grounded and enhanced in the fact that they've been directly elected by other members of Parliament, across all members of Parliament, across all parties. In addition to those very important reforms, the right reforms, Tony also produced a whole string of really interesting reports. And I've got some of them there. You'll see on the top of the right-hand column: good government, ministers and civil servants, and taking the measure of government performance, and so on. There are actually more than I've put in there. And I found them extraordinarily useful, particularly when you have civil servants sitting in front of a select committee being grilled. You can imagine what happens. They tighten up and they become a little reluctant to be frank. That's probably more likely to happen in our committee, which is a bit more confrontational, and particularly when it involves it's very, very specific and very precise, involving specific areas of public expenditure. In the Public Administration Committee, it tended to be more expansive because they were casting a brush across a broader canvas. And what tended to happen is that permanent secretaries and other very senior officials would be more relaxed, and they'd say things more candidly that they might not have said in front of the Public Accounts Committee. And in the reports in those days, I regret we've stopped it now to save money, but we used to print, all the select committees printed the entire verbatim transcript of the hearing in the appendix. So rather than just looking at the conclusions and the recommendations and a summary, if you are of such a mind, which I was, I'd sit there with a cup of tea and I'd just go through it and read that. And I found that a fascinating experience. It informed a great deal, actually, and I quote liberally from it in my own book, because it was a real source of illumination, with lots of senior witnesses from lots of different domains within government, ex-ministers. So you'd have two ex-Home Secretaries sitting next to each other. You'd have two ex-permanent secretaries and the Controller and Auditor General sitting next to each other, and lots of different permutations. And it was really very, very instructive. So I'd certainly take a look at those if you get the chance. And then there's some other things down there as well. One in particular, which I would also draw your attention to, right at the very bottom. This only came out quite recently. The think tank Reform published this little book, How to Run a Country, and it's actually available for free. You can download it. And it's got a lot of essays in it by different players. It's got quite a few essays by members of Parliament, but it's got quite a few essays by officials, by people in local government, and as well as academics. And people who've come into government from the outside, like John Brown, Lord Brown of Madingley, who used to run BP. So it's I think, a wonderful little book. It's got a lot in it that's worth looking at. So let me say just a little word about select committees more broadly, because the traditional view of select committees they've been around for quite a long time in one way or another, but there was for a very long time a view that they were really just partly because nobody had to get elected to go on them. And sometimes they were regarded as a place to put people to keep them out of trouble. And they would I remember vividly Ken Clark, when I was an undergraduate at the school, coming to a seminar and saying, well, I'm a bit of a maverick on select committees. I just think they're a place to put people to keep them out of trouble, and their reports gather dust and so on. And there was always some truth in that. I think there's now probably less truth in that than there has ever been. And it's partly because of the topics that select committees have conducted. It's partly because their status has changed because of the direct election of the chair and of the other members. It's partly because the media have worked out that it makes quite good television. I mean, you probably saw Lynn Homer, the chief executive of HMRC, on the television recently. We, on our Public Accounts Committee, have been looking at issues around tax and tax avoidance for 4 years. And it's now front and centre. It's a major issue. This HSBC thing has just broken. And it didn't happen overnight. It happened by worrying at it and prodding at it repeatedly over quite a long period of time. And the great advantage of a select committee compared with the chamber of the House of Commons, of course, is that if you ask a question and you don't like the answer, you can ask it again, and again, and again, and again, which, of course, you can't do in the chamber. So, for example, I thought it was rather strange that the government was spending £32 billion, it's now £42 billion, but at the time I was asking the question, it was £32 billion on HS2, the railway, and hadn't, in considering the broadband programme, decided, taken any. I mean, the idea of these business planning scenarios is you work out various different permutations, you work out counterfactuals, you consider how you might do things, what-if scenario planning. And one of the obvious things to me was, well, rather than spend £32 billion on a railway line, or 42 as it now is, what would happen if you spent £30 billion on broadband infrastructure? Because, plainly, if we all had 300 megabytes or 400 megabytes a second, it would alter work patterns quite significantly. If you really could do everything everywhere, in the vision of Steve Jobs, if it really, really didn't matter where you were, then that would significantly alter work patterns, it would significantly alter travel patterns. So it seemed to me a fairly obvious question to get the answer to. You know, what analysis did you do of the counterfactual of not spending the money, but instead spending it on fibring up the whole country to a very high level? And I could not extract an answer. The Department for Transport's Permanent Secretary talked about anything but. But I finally got him to, I only discovered this because somebody from the HS2 campaign put it on YouTube. Because after I'd asked him the 8th time, he finally admitted that no, they hadn't done. Well, I'd never got that. I'd never got that in the chamber. You only get it by going at it again and again and again. Some of you may remember, I was in Washington at the time. It was the year after I graduated from here. In 1987, I happened to be in Washington in July 1987 for a political trip. And it was at the time of the Iran-Contra hearings. This was a rather wicked wheeze whereby the Reagan administration, knowing that it was unlawful, was trying to find a backdoor route to supporting the anti-communist counter-revolutionaries, I suppose you'd call them, in Nicaragua. At the same time, they had some American hostages in Lebanon, and they were trying to get help from the Iranians through the back door, because obviously they weren't talking to the Iranians, to free the American hostages. And the idea was that they would ship weapons to the Israelis, who would then ship them to the Iranians, and don't forget the Iran-Iraq war was going on at the time. And then the Americans would replace those weapons with other weapons, and the payment for the previous ones would then flow to the Americans, who could then use the money to pay the Contras, as they were called, the counter-revolutionaries in Nicaragua. And obviously the only question to ask is what could possibly go wrong? Well, it went horribly wrong. And the outstanding exhibit in this fiasco was one handsome Marine colonel called Colonel Oliver North and his rather dashing and leggy assistant, Fawn Hall, I think her name was, who was busy shredding documents in the White House until sort of 5 in the morning, trying to get rid of all the evidence of what they'd been up to. And of course he was hauled before Congress, and it made the most gripping television. And all it was a bloke sitting there with a camera on him, being grilled and answering questions. And I was very fortunate. There were so many people queuing outside that they were turning over the seats every 30 minutes. You couldn't stay longer than half an hour. But I happened to be staying with somebody who worked in the office of the Sergeant-at-Arms of the Senate. And so I was able to get into a row of seats where I could stay all day, which I did. I completely ignored the conference I was at. I sat there for hours because it was so gripping. And the truth of the matter is, depending upon what's going on, what happens in select committees can be very gripping. Margaret Hodge said the other day in a lecture she was giving in the Speaker's State Apartments that although she is criticised for turning it into theatre and for grandstanding, she makes no apology for that because, as she said, grandstanding is one of the very few weapons that the committee has available to it. I think one has to choose one's moment carefully, but I take the point. I think it is that the power of publicity is one of the most important powers of committees. I've already said quite a lot about the National Audit Office, so I won't go into too much further detail about it, than to say this. There have been a number of changes in recent years. That is, for example, there used to be a body called the Audit Commission, which did for local government and for the NHS what the National Audit Office did for central government and for the executive agencies of central government, like the Rural Payments Agency and so on. And that it was announced that would be abolished some 3 or 4 years ago. Once, as is always the case with these things, the minister involved in that makes the announcement, and then they discover it's not so simple, and it takes several years to kill it off. But you may remember in the case of Tony Blair, he announced they were going to abolish the Lord Chancellor. Because why do you need one of these people in a wig, and isn't it all frightfully old-fashioned? And so I don't know whether the civil servants were just having a laugh, but they let him make the announcement, and then they said, oh, by the way, Prime Minister, can you tell us which bits of legislation you're going to drop so you can make room for the bill we're going to need? Because the Lord Chancellor's mentioned in over 500 Acts of Parliament. So it's going to take a while to get through all of those before we abolish him. Oh, they said, and suddenly we still have a Lord Chancellor. In the same way, the Audit Commission took quite a long time to kill off. But it was a body which had actually done a lot of work on a contracting out basis. In other words, private sector auditors were contracted to audit particular local councils, local authorities, district councils, metropolitan councils, county councils, and so on. And now most of the work is done on that basis. And there was a piece of legislation that took quite a long time to go through, the Local Audit and Accountability Act, where there was a little bit of a struggle going on, because the lazy assumption was you just take all the responsibilities of the Audit Commission and bung them into the National Audit Office. Well, it would have probably wrecked the National Audit Office, and the NAO had absolutely no interest in that happening. They have actually taken on 11 members of staff, but this is out of probably a couple of thousand. And much of the work that was done by the Audit Commission is now done under contract by private sector auditors, which quite a lot of it, probably 75% of it, was before already. And that's still bedding down, to be honest. And we're still in the idea is that you rotate every 4 years so that you don't get stuck with one auditor for too long. And it remains to be seen how it will actually work in practice. But the National Audit Office has also been changing, because one of the perennial questions facing anybody who studies this domain for any length of time is, why is it that government after government after government gets things wrong? I mean, we are looking at the taking of policy and the implementing of it using public money. And what's absolutely clear is that whether you look in the 1950s or the 1960s or the 1970s or the 1980s or the 1990s, or the 2000s or now, the same problems crop up again and again and again to do with lack of quality information, particularly lack of quality information about finance. There's very little high-quality financial management in Whitehall. I mean, I'm caricaturing it slightly because there have been some changes. There have been quite a lot of changes in recent years. But it is still the case that there is a very poor understanding compared with what you'd expect in most large private sector organisations, of how much it actually costs to do things. Famously, you have an enormous problem with government IT projects. It seems almost impossible for the government to procure an IT project successfully. And because most of what government does, just like most of what the private sector does, very often involves IT, there's almost nothing that doesn't involve IT. When I wrote this book, I only realised after I'd done it, which is why I decided I needed to have a chapter on IT projects specifically. And I don't remember, I don't think there are any. Perhaps there are, but I can't think of any political science books that talk about the role of IT in government failure. It's mostly a thing you'd find in business school books. But it seems to me, absolutely, if you want to really understand why things fail so often, you have to understand why IT fails. And it turns out, I mean, I wrote this book with Christopher Hope of the Daily Telegraph, who's also my brother-in-law. And he came on board. I was 18,000 words into what was supposed to be a 5,000-word chapter on the Rural Payments Agency and on footnote 57, when my publisher said, "Oh, we're not having any footnotes in this book." And so I called in Christopher, who helped me, and we became it became very much a joint project. But it's half about case studies of why things go wrong, and half about analysis of the relations between ministers and civil servants and IT, and what we can do about the fact that things go wrong. But of the first 11 case study chapters, 8 of them are actually essentially about IT projects going wrong. Some of them will be famous household words to you, the Child Support Agency. We had a huge problem with the Passport Agency in the summer of 1999. There was another one more recently because they didn't anticipate the increase in demand. But back in the summer of 1999, they suddenly announced that all children under the age of 16 would have to have their own passport. They could no longer travel on their parents' passport, as had hitherto been the case. But they forgot to join up the dots and tell the people who needed to know. And so you had queues round the block. And there was an added dimension of theatre because some of you will remember Mohammed Al Fayed, whose son used to go out with Diana, Princess of Wales. Mohammed Al Fayed is an Egyptian. He owns Harrods, or he did. And he wanted British citizenship, but he couldn't get British citizenship because for various reasons they decided they didn't want to give it to him. But he was very sympathetic to all these poor folk queuing around the block outside the Haute Passport Office building in Petit France. So he turned up with the Harrods food van. I mean, the officials had been handing out luncheon vouchers. It really was not that impressive. And then Mohammed Al Fayed turned up with an enormous Harrods van, you know, the green and gold, and handed out sort of gourmet food while they were waiting. And of course, the television crews went mad because they had nothing to do other than film all these people queuing. But things like the tax credits, there was a thing called the Individual Learning Account, which was an adult training scheme, the Criminal Records Bureau, another household word. The fact that they've changed the name now completely, it's called I can't even remember the name, but everyone still uses I think it's called the Barring and Disclosure Commission, thank you. That's right. Yeah, but nobody calls it that. Everyone calls it the CRB. So it's become such a swear word, it's just sort of stuck. The Rural Payments Agency, again, would be a household word. Certainly if you were a farmer, would be a household word. There was another enormous problem with the recruitment of junior doctors. There was another enormous problem with what was called the National Programme for IT and the Health Service, which was the world's largest civilian IT programme, which is meant to hook up every single body in the NHS with a sort of national patient record. The why they go wrong so often, squandering not millions, not tens of millions, not hundreds of millions, but billions and billions of pounds, was something that was beginning to cheese me off, frankly, beginning to hat me off. And I thought it merited further investigation. In fact, it turns out there are several important aspects about this which are not necessarily have made it as far as the newspaper headline writers yet. First of all, it's not true that all government IT projects go wrong. There are lots of government IT projects that go right. I've just come from Westminster Tube Station to Temple using my Oyster card, and it worked fine. And there was, apart from one Saturday afternoon when something went wrong with the system, there was a little glitch, and it forgot to deduct the fare so that people were travelling for free, at which point, of course, it got into the newspapers big time. Most of the time, the Oyster card has worked extremely well. The same is true of the London congestion charge. It's very good at spotting your car number plate and spotting whether you've actually paid your congestion charge or not. There are lots of IT projects that go well, but you just don't hear about them because they don't make news. It's also true that there are lots of IT projects in the private sector that go badly. But guess what? You don't hear about those either, because if you are the director of a company, particularly a public company quoted on the stock exchange, the last thing you want to do is show to the world all your failure and get it in the neck from your shareholders. So what will happen is if they see failure, they will close it down much more quickly. They will generally take decisions to shut it down much, much more quickly than in the public sector, and they are much more likely to try and hide any evidence of its ever having happened than in the public sector, where if it's bad enough, it will usually end up in front of our committee. So there are pressures in the public sector that make it different. But what it turns out is that whether an IT project is successful or not almost entirely comes down to not bits of hardware, not even in the first instance down to bits of software. It comes down to people, because it's people that write software. So whether you write good software that works well and that is lean and economical and does what it's supposed to do and doesn't waste time, rather depends upon whether the people doing the writing, the software engineers, have the right relationship with the people who want the product at the end. And that is so often not the case. I found it actually one of the most interesting chapters of the book to write, simply because it was something I had never really come across before, and which turns out to be so central for almost all aspects of human life in the advanced world now. And it's getting to the point now, and we're seeing this not only in relation to critical infrastructure, that things like water and electricity and telecoms are now heavily dependent on IT, but also from the point of view of a military strategist. Why drop bombs if you can send somebody a virus? This is now a completely new world, which 30 or 40 years ago people weren't really thinking about, and it's nearly central to nearly everything in what the public sector does. And it's particularly important, going back to the 3 E's of economy, efficiency and effectiveness. If you're trying to, as the mantra has it, do more with less, in an environment where we know there are going to be further constraints on public expenditure, finding nifty, clever, new ways to do things that actually provides a better service and cost a lot less is not going to happen without IT. So to me, it's a very, very important domain, and one which I think, personally, political students of government and students of politics in the last 30 or 40 years have paid scarcely any attention to, but which I think is a quite important omission, which is why I've banged on about it for a bit. Common themes for studies. I wanted to talk a little bit about the way in which the National Audit Office, and thus the Public Accounts Committee, goes about its work, because they have sector specialists. So, for example, to take a domain like transport or energy or defence, there will be a financial audit director and there will be a value for money director covering off that domain. So there will be 6 directors there, in those 3 areas of the National Audit Office, who lead the studies, who either lead the audit work on the various bodies within the MOD or within energy and climate change or within transport. And there would be a director leading off on the value for money studies that are produced, covering off all the different areas. And then we accordingly, when we take evidence and produce our own report, our report will generally have the identical title to the NAO report, because we've covered the same subject. So the NAO might produce a report on education called The Teaching of Primary School Mathematics. We will then get in the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Education, and probably some expert who's advising them on the teaching of primary school mathematics, who might have been involved in the implementation of their policy. And then we would grill them and produce our own report, which we would produce with conclusions and recommendations. The next stage of the process, and this what I've just described, is the way it would work for every type of NAO study. So whether we were looking at the Trident nuclear submarine, or whether we were looking at the treatment of nuclear waste at Sellafield, or whether we were looking at the decision by the government to sell the gold in the Bank of England at a low price just before gold shot up through the roof a few years ago, it would be the same process. We would take a study from the NAO on the subject, have the relevant witnesses in, and then produce our own report. And the NAO has recently restructured itself so that the disciplines which are required to do a good job, so to take the 3 that I just mentioned, for example, transport and energy and defence all involve big ticket items. They involve expenditure on rolling stock. They involve, for trains, they involve huge train lines. They involve expenditure on items that often run into billions of pounds. The same is true of defence, because, of course, there's a great deal of defence procurement involved. And the same is true of energy, because if you are figuring out, if you've got liabilities on your balance sheet to deal with the cost of dealing with nuclear waste going forward for 100 years, you might have got billions, tens of billions of pounds of potential costs sitting there, and you've got to figure out how you're going to manage it successfully. And the idea is that by putting these people in the same teams, you'll get a much higher degree of skill and learning, and then use the learning again elsewhere than would previously have been the case. And one of the central problems for the civil service is the way in which it doesn't seem to learn from its mistakes, and the way in which the same mistakes are repeated again and again and again. I mentioned IT at length, and some of it is to do with the failure to understand some fairly basic things about the way IT projects ought to be run. But it's deeper than that. It's it's a failure to understand much about how management should happen and about how leadership should happen, because many people who go into the fast stream of the civil service don't do so in the expectation that they're going to be managers of organisations. That's not really in many cases, the drive that puts them there. I'm going to quote from two people, actually. Kate Jenkins, who is a visiting professor of the school, I think, who used to, when the civil service reforms in the 1980s came along, they were called the Next Steps reforms. Kate Jenkins was really the key person who was involved in writing what became known as the Next Steps report. The other person I'm going to quote is a man called Stephen Rimmer, who until recently was the Director General for Crime and Policing in the Home Office. He was a very senior civil servant. He was also at school with me. We started on the same day. And he actually has an essay in this little reform booklet that I mentioned earlier. But I thought I'd quote it because I think this isn't the chapter on the civil service, but I think this illustrates the point in a quotation better than, or in two quotations, better than I can do in any other way. First, Kate's quote, which is from her book, a brilliant book, by the way, Politicians and Public Services. Much of the civil service was genuinely baffled. At senior level, their job was to discuss major policy issues. The management of resources and the management of government services were dealt with elsewhere. For many of them, the point of questions about management was unintelligible. Stephen Rimmer, meanwhile, who, by the way, earlier in his career as a civil servant was the governor. He was the youngest ever governor in the prison estate. He was the governor of Wandsworth Prison. He was on the management board of the Metropolitan Police. He's done a number of different frontline roles. He wrote this: "I cannot stress enough," and this, by the way, is an index of how things are changing, because this quote I found on the civil service website for fast stream recruitment. So and he was up there as one of the people who'd been through the process. But this is an index of, I suppose, how they would like to see themselves and how they think that things are changing. My fear is that it's changing much more slowly than it should. But this is what Stephen wrote: I cannot stress enough how important this time spent in operational delivery has been for my career. Not only have they been stimulating and challenging experiences in themselves, but they have also made me a more effective policymaker and strategist. After all, if you want to understand what delivery is really about, you actually have to do it. And there is still, notwithstanding the halo and the penumbra of intent that is obvious in that text, there is still quite a divide, I think, in practice in the civil service between those who want to have the smart jobs crafting policy and being near to ministers. There is, for some strange reason that I've never quite understood, a kudos that attaches to having a job that places you near a minister. Having met many ministers over the last 14 years, I would have thought you'd want the job that put you the greatest possible distance away from a minister, but that's not how it tends to be seen. And thus, going out and getting your hands dirty and actually delivering something and doing something is culturally antithetical to the way many civil servants have traditionally seen the world and their role in it. And of course it means that when they do get into positions where they're told, deliver this programme for integrating the information for the prison service and the national and the probation service, there was a project called CNOMIS, the National Offender Management Information System, I think it was. This was opposed to an earlier one I saw many years ago, NIPSIS, the National Probation Service Information Systems Strategy. They come along like London buses every so often. And in this particular one, CNOMIS, the project went up in cost like this, absolutely up like this, until it got to £690 million. And nobody knew that it was in trouble. Not only did the ministers who were in charge of the department not know it was in trouble, the programme board containing the civil servants who were supposed to be supervising it didn't know that it was in trouble. And eventually, the train hit the buffers and they said, what on earth's going on? And they canned the whole thing. And to this day, there's £161 million, which they cannot tell you what it was spent on. And this type of thing goes on again and again and again. And because of the cultural milieu that I described earlier, that civil servants don't expect to be managers, and they're not given the skills they need to be able to do this job effectively. They're not told how to be high-end, high-quality managers. If you think about it, what you really need to be able to do, if you've got a certain set of resources and you have to deliver something very tightly to a schedule. You've got to marshal those resources, which will be a range of things. There'll be people, money, technology, time, and marshal them to deliver a particular result by a particular moment. That's not what you go into the civil service for, largely, and it's not how you're trained and brought on. It's perfectly possible to teach those things. Most large companies seem to manage it, but the cultural baggage of the civil service never valued that. So we are now in the foothills of a process to try and make that the new normal. And I say we're in the foothills of a process. You can go back to the 1950s. There was a thing called the Technical Support Unit in the Treasury in the late 1950s, which was succeeded by a thing called the CCTA, which was the Central Communications and Technology Agency, which was succeeded by a thing called the OGC, which was the Office of Government Commerce, which ran on until quite recently, into the 80s. And it was founded, I think, in the 80s. It went on into the 90s and even into this century. And that has now been succeeded by a thing called the Major Projects Authority, usually stemming out of either the Treasury or the Cabinet Office. And I'm bound to say, I think I'm probably more optimistic than I've been for a long time. And I remember when I represented the management consulting industry 20 years ago, there was a thing called the Central Unit on Procurement in the Treasury. These functions in some shape or form have always kind of been there or roundabouts. But they were never fashionable, they never attracted the best people, and they never paid very well. And that's what they're changing. The Major Projects Authority is now getting really good people running it, really top-end people, and they're paying them well. And they've set up a thing at the Side Business School in Oxford called the Major Projects Leadership Academy, which is essentially, we're not there yet, but the aim is that you will not get to a point where you're in charge of a major project, like the C-NOMIS thing that ended up costing £690 million, unless you know what you're doing. And the poor person who was actually put in charge of that project had never run a programme of any kind of that, an IT program of that kind at all before. So it's completely unfair on the individual involved as well. And what we're now seeing is the beginning of a process to try and get away from that and trying to instill the kinds of disciplines in the way the civil service spends its money that you would expect to see in civil engineering if you were building a bridge, that you would expect to see in chartered accountancy if you were auditing a large private sector firm, that you would expect to see in many professional disciplines, but which has been very largely in many ways lacking from the way in which the civil service has gone about things. I said I'd talk a little bit about reforms, and I think I'll do that and then finish in time for some discussion. Because what becomes perfectly clear, if you look at it, frankly, just over the last 20 years, I mentioned Kate Jenkins and the Next Steps reforms. They were dated from around 87. It becomes clear, if you read Nigel Lawson's memoirs, that it only became clear to him it was happening quite late on, once a lot of the work had already been done. It was very much Mrs. Thatcher's project, I think, and she didn't tell even her own Chancellor about it. The effect of it was to take, when it was finished, about 70% of the people working as civil servants and transfer them into executive agencies of all kinds, be it well, it didn't exist then, but the type of thing such as the Rural Payments Agency, so that, as it were, you'd have one large group of people over here doing the implementing, and a much smaller group of people over here doing the thinking about the implementing. Now, and Kate Jenkins in her book goes on about this at some length, that the description I've just given is a complete misreading of what was intended to be the case. What was supposed to happen is that people here would know enough about the thinking and that the people here would know enough about the implementing. So that far from it being as what was often described as the separation of steerers and rowers, like a Roman galley, on the contrary, that was not philosophically what was supposed to be the intention. But that's certainly how it was interpreted. And what has happened in practice is that lots of executive agencies have gone off on their own journey, done their own thing, and ministers are suddenly finding not only that they don't have any effective control over them, but they don't even know what they're doing. And that's why you have seen in various domains people bringing back these functions within government. So, for example, they decided when they abolished the Child Support Agency they were going to have a new thing called the Child Support and Maintenance Commission, and that was going to be an executive agency too. But by the time they got to the point of creating it, they decided, no, we're just going to they're just going to be civil servants inside the department like anybody else, doing the implementing, because this separation had not worked in the way that it was intended. But Kate's project, Next Steps, was only one of many reforms. I won't even go back as far as the Fulton report in the 1960s, though I do mention it in the book. But if you just look over the last 30 years or so, there was in September 1982 a very important initiative called the Financial Management Initiative, which was basically designed to require government departments to understand what resources they'd got, what they were being applied to, and what they expected to get out of those resources, mostly money and people, in terms of outputs and outcomes. And it doesn't sound very revolutionary. It's something that many private sector organisations have been doing, if they wish to survive, for centuries. But this was seen as quite advanced. It didn't fully succeed, but it did introduce a degree of financial management discipline into departments that had previously been lacking. Then you had the Next Steps reforms that I mentioned earlier. By the time you got into the 1990s, you basically got into what became a litany. There was a white paper called Continuity and Change, the 1994 white paper Continuity and Change, which basically drove a coach and horses through the philosophy behind Next Steps. Next Steps had said, you can't run a thing like this as one large integrated civil service. It's got to be broken up with much more clear lines of accountability. Continuity and Change came along and said the exact opposite. The merits of an integrated civil service have served us well for 150 years. There was a thing that some of you may remember called the Citizens' Charter. This was John Major's, I thought, rather worthy attempt to make citizens, make officials understand and providers of public services understand the standard that their customers, the citizens, were entitled to expect. And the idea was you could complain if you didn't feel you were getting a good enough service. Continuity and Change was followed by Taking Forward Continuity and Change. This was followed by Modernising Government after the Blair government came in. This was followed by Civil Service Reform, Delivery and Values. And that was followed 12 months later by Civil Service Reform, Delivery and Values. A year later, 1 year on, it was called. Then you had the capability reviews. Then you had putting the front line first, Smarter Government. That was Gordon Brown's first outing. Then you had the Civil Service Reform Plan in June 2012. And then you had the Civil Service Reform Plan 1 year on, which came out last year. In other words, there have been at least 10 major attempts to prod the civil service into new behaviour in the last 20 years, roughly one every 2 years. And guess what? We're not that much further forward. We are a bit further forward. In some places we're probably quite a lot further forward. But what's clear is that simply iterating lists of things that are wrong doesn't solve the problem, because we've been doing that for 50 years. And what became clear to me was that we were missing a rather important component. And the component, I think, is, as Bill Clinton nearly said, it's behaviour, stupid. And it's certainly true for software. When IT projects go wrong, it's nearly always about behaviour. There's a wonderful, well, I think it's wonderful because it was, for me, a light bulb moment. There's a professor of computing at Cambridge called Ross Anderson. And I actually found this on a Daily Telegraph blog, but I just thought it was such a pithy way of putting the problem. He said this. He was talking about why IT projects so often go wrong. He said this: project managers must forever be closing down options early, while political managers try to keep all options open forever. And that, although he was talking specifically about IT projects, I think that is a summary of one of the problems facing anybody trying to make anything happen in a large public sector organisation. The tension between the requirements of Richard Mottram made this point in his capstone lecture, which is in the reading list, I think, somewhere. It's certainly in the reading list in the back of my book. If it's not on this sheet, I'm sorry, but it's called the capstone lecture. And you can certainly Google it. Richard Mottram, London School of Economics, you'll find it. He was a permanent secretary for 15 years. And he made this point, that essentially it's about managing the tension between the requirements of the political process and a competitive political environment on the one hand, and the needs of managing a large organisation on the other. And that tension is never going to go away completely, but if you understand that it is there, if you understand that that's one of the major issues you are confronting, you have a much greater chance of being able to do something about it. And I regret, put this quite as clearly as I wish I had. So hopefully when it comes out in paperback, I shall put it even more clearly. But it seems to me that we are we are missing something rather important about our behaviour. The first question, if you really want people to change, is you have to get them to change their behaviour. But the prior question to that, it seems to me, if you really want them to change their behaviour, is you have to understand behaviour, and you have to understand where behaviour comes from. Where does our behaviour come from? Consider the following descriptions. Schmoozing, scheming, consensus building, mediating conflicts, developing trust, abusing trust, mutual fear, total domination, reconciliation under the pressure of circumstances, the development of rivalries, the repairing of ruling coalitions. Which of these behaviours do you recognise? I would imagine you recognise probably all of them. They are all well-observed and well-documented behaviours of chimpanzees. In other words, we are social primates. The fact that we don't any longer swing through the trees doesn't mean that we don't behave with deeply, deeply embedded, pre-wired behaviours which protect ourselves. If you ever go on a shelter, if you ever go on a survival course, one of the things they teach you is, yes, we all know you die of food in a week. You die of lack of water in 3 days. What do you die of most quickly? Exposure. You can die of exposure in a few minutes. If you drop into the Arctic Ocean or if you're in the Sahara Desert, the exposure will kill you more quickly. In other words, the need for shelter is prior to almost everything else. Now, you put people in a large social environment, in an office or a factory or in a parish meeting or in a university institution, these human behaviours, these social primate behaviours, don't go away. They're still there. They just manifest themselves differently. And you can see this in mating behaviour, you know, men with gold watches and very fast cars. And and indeed, dare I say it, you can see women engaged in social primate behaviour as well. These things are very, very basic. Now, my contention is, if we want to get better outcomes in government, it might not be a bad idea to pay attention to some of this, because we'd probably learn quite a lot that would help us avoid making the same mistakes again and again and again as we've done in the last 50 years. And since it's my constituents through their taxes who are paying for it, that's something I would quite like to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, can I just open the questioning up with one about, I mean, if you're on the Public Accounts Committee and, you know, there are some humdinger reports that the PAC produces on the basis of NAO reports about, you know, I'm not almost making this, you know, more airplanes, you know, fighter planes that don't have wings, or fire control systems that have to be abandoned before they're introduced, whatever they are.
Yeah, hospitals without patients.
Right.
Aircraft carriers without planes.
Exactly. Now, I mean, given what you just said, do you feel that, and you mentioned Margaret Hodge's remark about the need to grandstand, to get attention, to put pressure on the system, but do you feel that there's a trail from what you're doing through government back into a visible consequence? I mean, does the government respond to all your reports? I should know this, I think they do.
Yes.
And when they do, can they demonstrate any evidence that the behaviour you're hoping will change?
Yes, they do, and I should have mentioned this, I'm sorry. The government is obliged to respond to all our reports, and they do so through a thing called the Treasury Minute, which, as the name suggests, is issued by the Treasury. I should also have mentioned, we sit in a horseshoe with the chair in the middle and all the other members of the committee around the sides, and the National Audit Office staff also on our side with the horseshoe, and a member from the Treasury sitting here. And one of the ranking Treasury ministers below the Chancellor is ex officio, always a member of our committee. At the moment it's Andrea Leadsom, who's, I can't remember if she's Economic Secretary or, I think she's Economic Secretary at the moment, but it's always one, either the Financial Secretary or the Economic Secretary or the Exchequer Secretary. But there's always a Treasury Minister there, and this stems from the origins of the committee under Gladstone in the 1860s, when the Treasury was trying to get a handle on Royal Navy estimates, which were always going off through the stratosphere. It was the sort of the government computer project of its day, the Royal Navy in the 19th century. And so the Treasury sits with us, and therefore all reports back to us come through the Treasury in this Treasury Minute. but they're actually, of course, drafted by the Department for Transport or the Department for Education or the Ministry of Defence, depending on what the subject is. And what they do is they take our specific conclusions and recommendations, and everywhere we have a recommendation, and they'll be numbered, they will have an answer. Recommendation 1, we think X, Y, and Z. Recommendation 2, we think A, B, and C. We think P, Q, and R, and so on and so forth. So there's a very direct tie-in like this between what we recommended and what they then say they're going to do. So I had a journalist phone me up the other day asking me about the HMRC report we'd done some while ago, and he'd bothered to look at the Treasury Minute, which most journalists don't, and he asked me what I thought of the Treasury answer, because we'd asked for them to go away and do some more work on the general scope of international tax structures and the degree to which there is systematic behaviour that treads the grey line between tax avoidance and tax evasion. In other words, that does things that thwart the intention of Parliament. And the Treasury Minute said, no, I don't think we will, thank you. And he phoned me up to ask me what I thought of that, to which I told him I thought if they believed the HMRC didn't need to do any more, then they were the only people on the planet who believed that, because everybody else thought that they did. And so there is a sort of circle with a completion of the process. But in terms of the grandstanding, I mean, I think probably it drives civil, particularly with the great flair with which Margaret Hodge does it. It drives some civil servants completely crazy, or to use Margaret's words, potty or crackers, because there is the very opposite of what one might call a forensic approach. It's kind of a kind of Thatcheresque flailing of the handbag, and it hits anything in its wake, you know. Sometimes it can be extremely effective, and sometimes it misses the target. But it is something which, well, civil servants have, I suppose, grown to cope with. And the good ones will stand their ground when they think they can be one of the most effective ways to perform as a witness, as a civil servant in front of the committee, is if you really think you've got a point, you don't have to get angry or shout. I knew the British Telecom guy who was trying to defend what they were doing on rural broadband was losing the argument when he started wagging his finger at us and shouting. But generally speaking, there are civil servants who believe very much in what they're doing and who are passionate about defending what they've done and giving a good account of it and explaining the issues that they've had to confront. And one of the most convincing performances you ever get is from somebody who bats the tennis ball back pretty firmly because they've got a good account to give and they're determined to get it on the record. And that I personally find very impressive. But you've got to give them enough airtime to do that.
I should say, we haven't referred to this, but Parliament TV, for those of you who are not aficionados of these things, when you find it, or when you found it, then you learn to find your way round Parliament TV, which is not the easiest website in the world, but it is. You can find all of these parliamentary sittings, PAC and other committees, Lords committees, main chambers, and indeed the Westminster Hall debates, all there, all archived, all. Once you know how to find your way. Well,
I would endorse that, and I'm sorry, I thought I'd put that. I had the thought of putting parliamentlive.tv on here, and I seem not to have done, which is annoying. But it is parliamentlive.tv. If you get to the page which says, it's got three main icons, and one says what's on, and the next one says archive. If you go into the one that says archive, you then get a choice of House of Lords, House of Commons, committees, or Westminster Hall. And if you delete all the ones you don't want, and then you choose a date, you'll get a list of everything that happened that day. And actually, once you get to that point, it's really easy to navigate. But
exactly.
You just got to find that point.
Just have to learn
it. And it's got a record of every committee hearing. It's I think, a terrific resource.
It's great stuff. It's great stuff. Right. Questions? Like to chat there? Yeah.
I believe we have a government digital service.
Yes.
Is it effective?
I think it is. I've actually mentioned the government digital service at some length in the latter part of the chapter on IT, because essentially, and there's a chap called Mike Bracken who runs it. In fact, Tony and I were at the same seminar, Govern Up, run by Nick Herbert, who's a Conservative MP, and John Healey, a Labour MP. They've run a research programme over the last 6 months, and they presented some of the results at a seminar at the Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre last week. And in the session that was talking about digital. Michael Bishard, Lord Bishard, who's now the chairman of the National Audit Office, he's just become chairman, said we are in the presence of digital royalty, because here is Mike Bracken, he was sitting in the front row. And what the important thing he's done, and very much with the backing of Francis Maude and his whole agenda of reform, which has crucially got the backing of the Prime Minister, has done is say, look, government isn't that big. You think it is, and yes, there are hundreds of thousands of employees in various different domains, but if you look at the different functions that government performs, there are only about 693 of them. From issuing a licence to bury someone at sea, to getting a tax disc for your car, except of course we're now going to do that differently, and so on and so forth. So why don't we look at it from the point of view of the user, the customer, like any business would? And if you look at it that way, as he points out, most government functions are not that much bigger than the average dating site on the internet. But every time he's tried to make this point internally within a government department, they always turn around by saying, well, I'm sorry, that wouldn't meet the needs of the department. And as he says, and I quoted him in the book, saying, because we went to interview him, in fact, my co-author went to interview him, how it can be the case that the needs of the department always trump the needs of the customers completely beats me. So what he's doing is quietly revolutionary, actually. Is he effective? I think he's making important, quiet progress. But there's a very important computer journalist called Tony Collins, who's been one of the great doyens of the sector, that's to say IT journalism, and this is a very important point about accountability, actually, whom I will quote what Tony said, because it's so germane to your question. In actual fact, just going to find the right slot. Here we go. So Tony said this. GDS, Government Digital Service, has made a difference in terms of the attitudes to big projects. But in terms of savings, it is working on the margins. They have made steps towards it with the cloud. But tackling the big procurements, where tens of billions of pounds are, has not really happened yet. GDS is setting the example. It knows what needs to be done. And at least in theory, it has the power to do it. But it can't actually force the changes through the changes, because it is not responsible for any failures. The big reforms and standardisations of government administrative procedures haven't happened yet. Now, that's 18 months old, so it's probably slightly less true than it was. But it goes back to the point about the accounting officer and the permanent secretary and the budget. Because the permanent secretary is, and I should have said this more clearly, is the person who is legally responsible to Parliament for how that budget is expended. And if he or she doesn't think it's going to be spent in a way that's effective and efficient and economic or legal, he can say, Minister, if you want me to do that, you'll have to issue me with a letter of direction. And the line of accountability is very, very clear, running through the accounting officer to the Secretary of State. The trouble is, when you get the supply of services of kinds that cross-cut, that go across different departments, which often happens with I mean, if you consider the number of different public agencies who are involved with difficult-to-help families. So obviously you may have social services and you may have children's services as well as adult social services. Very likely you might have the criminal justice system. You'll probably have the police, you'll have the courts, you'll have the magistrates, and you'll have the probation service. You might very well have the health service. There might be drug dependency or alcohol dependency. So you would think, wouldn't you, the obvious thing to do would be to have, this is a slightly different point from the digital point, but a lot of it applies as well, would be to have a holistic service that took into account all the needs of those folk and said, right, well, we're spending a huge amount of money on this relatively small number of people who are causing a disproportionate amount of trouble, people with chaotic lives. How about we had a more integrated approach? And that's exactly what the government has sought to do through the Troubled Families Programme. The trouble is, the moment you start to blur the lines of accountability for who is responsible for where the money goes, then it's when things go awry, as they very often do, and you ask the question, sorry, who took this decision? That very quickly starts to blur. And that is also true in the IT space, unless you're very, very careful. But I mean, I personally think the government digital service is, as I say, quietly revolutionary. It's got huge potential. Still a long way to go.
Okay, yep. At the front here.
Thank you for such a great talk. Do you think part of the problem may be, you were talking about primates, and that was very interesting. Do you think there's just not enough fear amongst this group of people that maybe what they can get away with losing billions of pounds of our money and know there's no consequence? So it sounds like a bit of a free-for-all. If there was an actual fear of going to jail and accountability for fraud and gross misconduct, would that not make people start thinking about their responsibilities in the line of command and how the jobs to be executed? Wouldn't they be more focused with that? It does seem like they can commit any crime and just walk away with billions.
Yeah, can I build up? It's a good question, because in The Blunders of Our Government, the book that's listed on your reading list here, the authors of that book were very clear that some of the big failures in government, exactly at this point, were because those involved knew they were making decisions without any sense that if it went wrong, there'd be any payback, any consequence.
Yeah. I think that this is a perennial theme. The extent to which wouldn't people be more accountable? I mean, in the old days, in local councils, and in the very old days in central government, people were personally surcharged if they got it wrong. So you'd have to pay it back. There was a piece in the paper a few days ago about the proposed changes in the regulations for senior bankers that was going to introduce an element of personal liability. And the line I saw in the Financial Times was from top bankers throwing out their toys out of the pram because this was just going to stop top people taking part. To which my first thought was, well, hang on a minute, I think NM Rothschild and JP Morgan took personal liability. They were some of the most successful financial institutions in history, and they're still around to this day. The whole problem with the crash, of course, was that there was no alignment between taking decisions that might personally benefit you but risk the entire institution. So there was an asymmetry of risk and reward for you versus the risk to the institution. And that's why things like Barings blew up and all the other explosions we've seen, and then eventually the entire crash. I have a lot of sympathy for that approach. And what Tony said about the sense that they can implement drivel and drive on until they hit the buffers because they know that nothing will happen. That's the urban myth. Or that's the rhetoric around this space. And I think there is some truth to it. If you scratch harder under the surface, I think it's only a part of the story. I think it's really that civil servants, however idiotic the ideas of the ministers of the day, however poorly thought through the ideas of the ministers of the day, if they really want to do them, if they really want to implement them, then civil servants try their level best to implement what it is that ministers have asked for. The example of the Rural Payments Agency is a good one because farmers were so badly implemented, farmers were committing suicide. This was a payment system that was supposed to result in more efficient processing of payments under the single farm payment. When you dig under the surface, when you go into the verbatim transcripts, actually it was a DEFRA committee report, hundreds of pages long. I spent weeks reading this stuff for the chapter on the Rural Payments Agency. Turns out, senior officials, one of the most senior officials in DEFRA said, Minister, if you do this, it'll be a nightmare. Another official, the most senior official in this particular project from the Rural Payments Agency said, Minister, if you do this, it's madness. But they went ahead and did it. It was the implementation of what was called the dynamic hybrid method of calculating single farm payments. You could either do it on an historic basis or you could do it on a kind of more fluid basis, but they came up with the most complicated method available, chose to implement it in the shortest of all the possible timetables, while getting rid of all their most experienced staff and replacing them with temporary agency workers who were forced to work antisocial hours on the minimum wage. Guess what? It went wrong. Now, you could say, well, shouldn't the civil servants have somehow done something?
So should there be a process where ministers could face gross misconduct?
Yes. Well, I personally think in that particular case, I mean, what was extraordinary about it was that there were two ministers involved, both of whom went on to become Foreign Secretary, Margaret Beckett and then David Miliband. And they were, I think, in most cases, trying to keep as distant from it as they possibly could, so that it didn't taint them. I mean, because I happened to know Tony Collins, he drew it to my attention very early on, I got involved in tracking the National Program of IT in the Health Service from 2002. So by the time the change of government came in 2010, we were on our 8th or 9th minister who was responsible. And then my Conservative colleague, Simon Burns, eventually became the minister with responsibility for that area. And I think from his point of view, there was this long-standing path full of dog poo, and it wasn't his fault it was there. He just inherited it. And his aim in life, politically, was to get from one end of the path to the other without stepping in any of it. I mean, literally. So, I remember his once saying to me, Richard, I'm so tired of being, because I had some very good information on that particular project from inside the programme. I remember his once saying to me, Richard, I'm sick and tired of being told things by you and then finding out 6 months later that they're true. And it does then beg the question of the quality of advice that ministers are getting and from whom they're getting it. The truth is, I've always said that I think there's enough blame to go round. Yes, I think you do have to, in some cases, blame officials, but I think equally often you have to blame ministers and the interaction between them. If you're going to have something that is successful, they all have to be on the same page. They all have to understand what they're doing. They all have to know what they don't know and figure out and show judgment in whom they choose to do it. Because lots of people who supply to government can tell you that they can do things when it turns out on closer inspection that actually they can't. But they like a government contract, so they're quite happy to spin a yarn. And so you need pretty savvy, sophisticated, sceptical buyers, and that's one of the core skills that we don't have enough of.
Okay, let's take one more back there, because we won't have to finish, I'm afraid.
Yeah, okay.
Because there was a famous example of the fire communication
control,
report, which I won't name the minister, who actually just went on the Today programme to say it was the civil servant's fault, which I thought was something of a constitutional novelty. Anyway, over there.
Thank you. There's been a lot of talk about MPs having jobs and other lives before they become members of Parliament. Should there be consideration that those at the higher levels, at least, of the civil service have similar experience before coming into the civil service to try and counter some of the things you've talked about today?
Not only has there been consideration of it, but in practice what's happened. Charles Clarke, when he was a cabinet minister, he was my neighbour in Norfolk, was making this point 10, 12 years ago. He said when he was Home Secretary, they had to appoint at the Deputy Secretary, the Director General level, the G2 level, several people. They had 3 Deputy Secretaries they had to appoint during his time as Home Secretary, and he was only Home Secretary for a year and a half. And in each case, they appointed somebody from outside the civil service. Why? Because they couldn't find somebody inside the organisation who had acquired over a 20-year career the right skills. They didn't want to do that. They'd tried extensive internal advertising, but they simply couldn't find the right people. And if you now look, you do see, when we have witnesses, we often see, we get the CVs, and very often the people just below permanent secretary level are people who have experience of running things. So, some organisation like the Department for Transport or DWP is running a call centre, and there is a woman with 25 years' experience of, guess what, running call centres, most of which are in the private sector. So, yes, is that good? Yes, I think it is good. On the other hand, it's bad if it means that the career formation from the people at the bottom doesn't work properly. I think you need both. Again, I'm sorry to quote him so often, but he's a very wise man. Richard Mottram made this point, that every major or every large organisation on the planet does grow its own talent, does have a graduate recruit programme. But I think it's not only about that, it's about a combination of things. And as for, I spent the best years of my life, when I should have been chasing girls and building a career and making money, shoving leaflets through doors. And so do many of my colleagues. So what happens is you get into Parliament, and then you get made a minister, and then perhaps a Secretary of State. You are running an organisation, at least notionally running. You're also constitutionally responsible for running in every detail. I found that there's a very interesting exchange between Sir Nick Montague, who's Chairman of the Inland Revenue, and Sir Michael Quinlan, who used to be the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Defence, which I go into in some detail in the chapter on ministers and civil servants, about what that actually does or does not mean. But in practice, Quinlan said, Mr. Heseltine, when he was Secretary of State for Defence, he had a huge amount of experience. It would have been quite improper for me as a civil servant to say, no, you don't deal with that, I deal with that. So a permanent secretary has to be able to cope with a minister like Heseltine, who's got very firm ideas on management, and at the same time cope with somebody who's got a very different style, brings other qualities to bear, perhaps a brilliant communicator, but quite possibly no idea or interest in management. And still the show has to stay on the road. So you kind of need both. But my point is, it's hardly surprising that most ministers, Heseltine was of course an exception, it's hardly surprising that most ministers get to that level without having experience of running large organisations. If they did have experience of running large organisations, they would never have got to the point where they were as members of Parliament. So that's why I think you should take it absolutely as routine that when you become an MP, because we don't have any continuous professional development, which I think is nuts, but when you become an MP, it should be a standard part of the procedure. It should be standard operating procedure that you too, as well as senior civil servants, go off to the Major Projects Leadership Academy. You'd probably have a slightly different programme, but so you make people understand. Do you realise if you become a minister, the chances are that you will, within your first few weeks, take decisions where if you delay them, every week you delay them is going to cost £3.6 million. And so people understand, because nobody tells you that. So you find out that, and of course, the wise and sensible civil servants with good relationships will, but that's just a vignette of part of the problem. People don't understand the impact of the decisions they're taking or not taking, and that's what needs to change.
Okay, on that note, we must, I fear, finish. Thank you very much again, Richard, for an excellent lecture. And next week, we will hear from Professor Simon Hicks on the British government's relationships with Europe. See you again then. Thank you.